Capital Projects Podcast, an open and relaxed conversation regarding capital project management challenges.
Hello to all of my dear friends and loyal listeners of the Capital Projects Podcast. I am André Choma, your host, and I am here once again for yet another open and candid conversation about capital projects. So today, we're going to talk about something known as fast tracking. And you know, in my opinion, fast tracking is actually the very best and fastest way to lose value in a capital project. It really is, if you stop and think about it, you know. So exactly. You know, this topic is incredibly controversial, like really, really controversial. In fact, it's so controversial that I decided to go ahead and produce not just a single episode, but actually 4 whole episodes. That's right, a whole mini-series within our podcast, all dedicated to talking about this one issue. And it's an issue that's really common, not just here in Brazil, but all around the world, you know. Each episode is going to focus on a key aspect of this topic, and we'll do it in a simple and straightforward way. And you'll notice the episodes are going to be shorter, too, which should make our discussion a lot easier for you to follow. So, to kick off this series, in this very first episode, we're going to talk about what fast tracking actually means from the perspective that we want to discuss here. Then, after that, we'll have an episode that explores the results that projects deliver when they follow this path. And honestly, it can't even really be called a method, and we'll get into why that is. The third episode is going to cover what actually leads companies to use fast tracking, or more accurately, to apply fast tracking in FEL. And finally, in the fourth and last episode of this mini-series, we're going to discuss what we can do to avoid fast tracking altogether, or at least how we can reduce its risks if we find ourselves in a situation that kind of demands it. So, let's take a moment to better understand what fast tracking actually is, and what it ends up causing in projects. As I mentioned earlier in our opening, it's really the most efficient way to lose value. But you might be wondering, how, André? How exactly do you lose value? Well, let me tell you. It means delivering projects that are way over budget, way past the originally estimated deadline, with a much longer schedule than we had planned, and with operational results, performance, and output that are all well below expectations. That's pretty much what we can say about project outcomes when they're done with fast tracking. But then another question comes up. If the results are so disastrous, then why do we still see so many cases of fast tracking in the market, day after day? That's a point we're going to address throughout this series. But first, let's take a step back and get a better understanding of what fast tracking means from the perspective I want to cover here in our podcast. Let's start by looking at what the PMI's PMBOK guide defines as fast tracking. Fast tracking, which is translated into Portuguese as paralelismo, is described in the 6th edition of the PMBOK as a schedule compression technique, where activities or phases that are normally done sequentially are instead carried out in parallel, at least for part of their duration. For example, you might start building a building's foundation before the entire architectural design is completely finished and validated. That's the example they give in the PMBOK. And they also note that this approach is a form of schedule compression that can be used when you need to finish the project sooner than originally planned. It's a trade-off, you see, between time and potential rework. Now, parallelism can result in rework, and it increases risk. It only really works when activities can be overlapped to shorten the project schedule, especially the critical path. Using leads for schedule acceleration usually increases coordination efforts between activities and also raises quality risk. It can also increase project costs. So that's the PMBOK definition. It's basically parallelism between activities or phases. So why does it increase risk? Well, because if activities should be done sequentially, one after another, when you force an overlap, any eventual incompatibility or change in the predecessor task tends to trigger changes or rework in the successor activity. There was a logic for them to happen in sequence. And when you start treating them in parallel, you risk making an alteration or discovering some interface or interference that impacts the activity you've already started, the one you should have been waiting for. So this can increase risk. It certainly does increase risk, and it can bring quality issues if it's not well coordinated. The reason it increases risk is because, you know, when you have a predecessor activity that is not yet complete, any changes or issues discovered later in that predecessor will inevitably affect the successor that you've already started. That means you might have to redo some work, or at least make adjustments. So it's a gamble, really. Now, it's really important to understand that this practice is extremely common in all sorts of projects when it comes to schedule planning. Anyone who works with projects with planning is very used to not waiting for one work front to completely finish before starting the next one. That's just our day-to-day in projects. For example, imagine you're building a warehouse for an industrial plant. You start assembling the steel structure and roofing. At the same time, you need to pour the industrial floor. Now, you don't need to have the entire area covered before you start working on the floor. Especially if the project is large, you can work in sections. So if the roofing is already advancing, you'll have a part of the area that's already covered. That's where you can begin preparing and pouring the floor. And then you continue sequentially as more area gets covered. So you're working the two activities in parallel, but not on the same front at the same time. It's a smart way to save time. Another case we can mention. If I'm pouring the concrete structure, say for my industrial building or the same warehouse, I can do a pre-assembly of the steel structure on the ground and then lift it in modules onto the columns for a faster assembly. So I'm working on fronts that have some interface, and I work them a bit in parallel precisely to save time. So this is not a bad thing, and as I said, it's quite common in project planning. And that's why understanding fast tracking is so crucial for anyone involved in project management. It's a tool that can be used wisely or carelessly, and the difference is huge. So, when we talk about fast tracking, we need to remember that it's not inherently good or bad. It's a technique that, if applied with caution and proper coordination, can help us deliver projects faster. But if we just rush into it without considering the risks, we can end up with rework, cost overruns, and poor quality. And that's exactly what we aim to avoid. So let's dive deeper into each aspect in the upcoming episodes.